to our second education session to learn a little bit more about what's behind all this. Today I'm going to be talking about the Book of Discipline, basically the rules, where they come from, how they exist. I have some stuff to hand out here. If everybody wants to take one of these and pass them around. Yes. And three. So anyway, thank you for handing those out. The United Methodist Church actually has a couple of books you may hear about. One is the Book of Discipline. The other is the Book of Resolutions. If it's in the Book of Discipline, it's law. If it's in the Book of Resolutions, it's a suggestion. So that's the difference. Simply put, that's the difference between the two. I also have this little book that says the organization of the Methodist Church. So if you just want to really understand how we're organized, it takes this much. So we're not, it's simple on one level, but as you get into the details, there's a lot going on. But the Book of Discipline constitutes the law and the doctrine of the church. And it's important to recognize at the start of this discussion that it's something that's written by humans. It's written by a worldwide body, not just folks in the United States. It represents a majority of votes from that world body. It's not a consensus, and that's a very different thing. A consensus would be something that we all talked about, and we come out with, okay, we all agree this is the best way forward. That's not how it is designed. It's designed by who has 51 votes versus who has 49. So there is a lot of disagreement often as we go through the Book of Discipline. But the other thing that's really neat about it is it's designed to be challenged. The book itself holds the rules about if you don't like what's in there, how do you go about changing it? And that's something that happens every time the General Conference meets. Every 4 years, the Book of Discipline gets changed. Somebody was telling me the other day that their father had picked up a 1820 something version.
No, it's 1832.
1832.
A friend of mine has it. It's smaller than this book.
Yeah.
Like much smaller than this book. So between the 1800s and the 2000s, we've picked up a lot more bureaucracy and structure.
Yes.
A lot more laws.
Yeah, a lot more than we did. But that idea that it continues to change is part of the way it was created, and it also goes along with that whole Wesleyan understanding we have that we are not perfect. We continue to go on towards perfection, and that means we keep trying to get it right. We keep re-looking at what we're doing and thinking it over and saying, well, let's try and make it a little better. The first Book of Discipline for the Methodist Episcopal Church, which is what it was at that time, was published in 1784, following the very first thing that could be considered a general conference. It was called the Christmas Conference. It was held in Baltimore at Lovely Lane Chapel. And it was the first attempt to say, the revolution is over. We are no longer part of the Anglican Church. What are we? Because we're not connected to England like we had been before. That conference actually created what came to be known as the Methodist Episcopal Church in America, independent from the Anglican Church, which is where we had been before. It's important to remember Methodism had been a movement within the Episcopal or the Anglican Church, not a separate church. John Wesley never wanted to become a separate church. Even though many people, even in his day, were arguing that they should be, he always fought against that. So this idea of separating the church in America into something different actually went against what he was wishing for. The Christmas Conference also created the first bishops in America. Up to that point, there were none. We had superintendents who were people that Wesley had appointed to come over here. Even though the Anglican Church wasn't doing it, he was doing it on his own. And those first two were Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury. Have you ever bought a book from the Methodist publishing house, Cokesbury? That's where those two names come from. And it was done by an election of the gathered people, not by a succession of ordination from bishop to bishop to bishop. So that all those things broke the rules as they existed and said we need to look at what's going to be best for us moving forward and not stick with what the Anglican Church had in place. Interestingly, the Christmas conference also passed a motion to stamp out slavery in 1784. It said it is illegal for a Methodist pastor, Methodist clergy person to own slaves. And by the next time they meet, they had to throw that out. Because the pastors in the South didn't like that. It was a big, debatable object, and so at the next time they met, it became each conference will establish for itself what the rules are on slavery. And finally, for the first time on American soil, elders, deacons were ordained to serve their churches rather than relying on a few ordained clergy who have been ordained in England and sent over. So that is a turning point in our history. A lot of things changed and became against what the church had always said at that point. A new book of discipline has been published every fourth year since then, which is why we had 2012, 2016, all the way goes back to this 1780 date. And it gets done every quadrennial or every fourth year after the General Conference meets and votes on what needs to be changed. The most recent edition is 2016, which means 2020, next spring, will be another meeting that will be looking at it again. What happened this spring in 2019 was a special General Conference. It was called specifically to look at that one issue, and everything that was put into place at that point comes up for question again in a few months. So hopefully 2020 will help us see a better way to get through this rather than a lot of the division that exists right now. The basic unit reference in the book, if you want to look at it, you don't look things up by page number, you look things up by paragraph. Some paragraphs are 3 or 4 lines long, some of them are 20 pages long. It's not a paragraph like you think of in writing, but it's a unit of division that's called a paragraph. And sometimes numbers are skipped. You'll have paragraphs, say 70 through 80 are set aside for a certain type of thing. And if you don't need all 80 of them, you start the next section with paragraph 81. So if you ever take a look at it, you may think there are missing paragraphs. It's not. The pages are missing. It's just those are there to allow for growth in the future. Yeah, skip over that part. Some portions, this is a quote from the UMC website. It says, UMC is a worldwide denomination united by doctrine, discipline, and mission through our connectional covenant. The General Book of Discipline expresses that unity. Each central conference may make changes or adaptations to the General Book of Discipline to more fruitfully accomplish our mission in various contexts. What that means is that if you're in something called a central conference, which is basically every place in the world except the United States, if you disagree strongly with something that's in the General Book of Discipline based on your culture, it just doesn't fit the culture, they are able to change many parts of the book to fit their needs. We, however, in the United States cannot do that because we are considered annual conferences and jurisdictions, not general conferences. Central, not central conference. Thank you. The wording is very convoluted. There is a rule, though, that some portions of the General Book of Discipline are not subject to adaptation. Those are the history, the Constitution, the things that everybody must live by. And just real quick, there are the parts of the book. Part 1 is the Constitution. Part 2 is called the Global Book of Discipline. It's basically an understanding, it's only 1 page, and basically an understanding of how it applies and may be changed by general conferences. That quote I just read comes from that general or global book of discipline. Part 3 is doctrinal standards and our theological task, and I'll come back to that in a second. Part 4 is the ministry of all Christians. So there are pieces in the Book of Discipline that talk about everybody in the church and what they should be doing and how they should be relating to each other, not just clergy. Part 5 is the social principles, the preface and the preamble. And part 6, which is most of the book, is called Organization and Administration. There's a section on the local church, a section on ordination, a section on the superintendents, one on the conferences, one on administrative order, a whole section on church property, and finally a newer section on judicial administration. Blah, 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 blah. A lot of that stuff that nobody ever reads or cares about until they have a question and they have to go to it. The history, the Constitution part, and the social principles are things that more generally, more people are likely to read them. You may have heard me talk in a couple of messages, and Holly's probably talked about it, on the Wesleyan quadrilateral, through which Scripture is supposed to be understood in relation to experience, tradition, and reason. Most of what I gave you in the handout is that described in the Book of Discipline. So it actually is laid out there, and there's 4 pages of this handout that are supposed to help you understand what that means. That's not so important for today, but for some of the future conversations we're going to have, it might be helpful for everybody to read that before we get to future sessions. Because then some of the things we're going to talk about why, if Scripture says this, why doesn't everybody follow exactly what Scripture says? It comes down to what these 4 pages say, how we as Methodists should be interpreting Scripture. So that's why I wanted to give that part to you today. The Book of Discipline is the source of all the rules that are at the heart, though, of the current conversation we're having, not just here, but in many places around the world. And as the source of those rules, it goes back to 1972, when this incompatibility clause was put in. And I'll get into that one a little bit more, but before we go into the details, I thought it might be good for Holly to explain to you what General Conference is like.
Well,
or whatever you want to share about
right,
it.
and I sent the Book of Discipline around for anybody who wants to look at it. You just mentioned the sections. Each of those sections of that book, there's a local church section, ordained ministry, superintendency, annual conferences. Each of those has what's called a legislative section. So a general conference meeting takes between 10 and 14 days. I think they've carved them back from 14 till 10 or 11. And for the first half of that time, there are 800 to 1,000 people divided up into legislative sections. So that one group is looking at all the petitions that came in around the superintendency, and one is looking at all the petitions that come in around ordination and deciding, is this something that the whole body needs to look at? Is this something that is so far afield that our subcommittee says it's not worth bringing to the whole body, or is it something that is such a no-brainer that we recommend just voting it in? And so it's sort of this funnel of thousands of pieces of legislation going through 7 or 8 committees, and some of it then coming to the floor with the whole 800 or 900 or 1,000 delegates who are half clergy and half lay and from all over the world. So I've said this before, it's an interesting process. It's a process that was born with the church in the early days of the US based on United States democratic process. I don't think that it is always and forever the best way to do God's work, and there are lots of folks who think that we can come up with better ways of discerning God's will than having majority votes. But yeah, when you look at that book, each of those sections has had a team working on, hundreds of bits of legislation that come for their particular piece before the whole body gets to look at it. Is that helpful? Is there anything else that you've wondered or have questions about how General Conference works?
Can you just go through quickly what happens after that? What it looks like when the body works on something? Without getting too upset.
So when we get to the plenary floor, and everybody's come from their legislative sections, and some things are on a consent calendar, and you might get people who are saying, oh, we're going to try to pull these off the consent calendar and bring them to the floor. It's day after day after day of debate and attempts to amend. Speeches for and against. Another one of my quarrels with the process is that it is a Western English-based process trying to serve a global community. So everyone, Korean, people who speak Korean and Swahili and French and Spanish and several other languages get translators, instant translation. They're still working on it. Folks who aren't from a Western democratic structure are at a disadvantage working with our process. So I've seen, a bishop say, okay, I'm going to take a speech over here. Is it a speech for or against? And the person will be like, I just have this thing to say from my heart. I don't know if it's a speech for or a speech against. And they'll be ruled out of order because it's not time for that. So I've seen people sort of cut short in their ability to try to be part of the process because it is it's an American English-based left-brained process. So,
Okay,
anything else? Any other questions? Yes.
Is there a presumption that consensus can be reached?
Well, I think that the way that we've been doing business presumes that it can't. So Quakers, obviously a much smaller community, do work on the theological assumption that a consensus can be reached and that God has some direction for God's people. We seem to work from the presumption that we have to fight things out and live with the majority rule because we can't trust enough to try it a different way. That's my sermon on the matter.
And when there's disagreement, then the only solution is I can't worship with you, I have to be separate.
Or I have to live with the will of the 51%, which is what we do in our political world.
Right. But that's why there's 4,500 denominations in the United States. I did not make that number up.
And that's also why, although a chunk of my 30 years of ministry have been at the denominational level, at least the annual conference level, my hope is in the local church because that's where the relationships are. And so I do believe that we can learn to live together and seek God's guidance and try to be the best community we can be in ways that it's very difficult to do across the whole globe. And so I'm happy to put my energy more in the local church than the larger church at this point in my life. And my hope is that whatever structure emerges gives more autonomy to local churches and regions so that we can do our thing and not spend all our energy on global politics that is almost impossible to resolve.
It's interesting because even though they don't exist anymore as a named church, the Congregationalists had that idea.
Right.
Oh, they do exist.
They're
Pardon me?
called UCC. United Church of Christ.
They still exist, just not under the name congregation.
So, yeah, can we have unity of Wesleyan thought and doctrine and not have uniformity of structure everywhere in the world? Because we already don't have uniformity of structure. Churches in the African countries could not begin to afford to do things the way that we're required to do things in terms of insurance and buildings and even staffing committees. It's just different.
I've heard they got rid of some of the straw buildings, finally.
I don't know.
In
I mean,
Africa.
buildings are not a requirement for church in many parts of the world. So I don't know if that's helpful or not.
All right, thank you, Holly.
My experience.
That's great, but as much as I've watched it, I've never been there. I don't get the same sense of emotion of being in the room. But I thought that was important because if we want to look at the question that leads to where, or started where we are today, back in 1972, you may recall that the United Methodist Church was created from the merger of the Ecumenical United Brethren and the Methodist, I think it was just the Methodist Church at the
The
time.
Methodist Church,
Right.
which was the successor to the NE Church and the NB Church South.
Right. But that came together in '68, and at that point, they decided we need to look at the social principles again. And a team was created that spent 4 years looking at all the questions and all the parts of that. And most of them, what they came up with, came to the floor, and there was a little bit of debate or question on it, but then most of those things passed through fairly easily. One of the things they came up with, though, was this statement on homosexuality. And it includes, a lot of it is actually still in there today. The handout I gave you, the first part of it is paragraph 1G. Paragraph 161G. Paragraph 161 is on the nurturing community. Section G is looking at human sexuality. And in that, the committee come up with this idea that they spent all these years looking at and doing studies and looking at the psychological and the medical and all the different parts, all the information that was available. They came to conference with this statement. And it basically says, we affirm that sexuality is God's good gift to all persons. We call everyone to responsible stewardship of this sacred gift. And it went through more of that. But in the end, it never said anything about homosexuality is incompatible. From the floor of conference, some people who had bad experiences in their own life in the past started to make amendments. And then there were amendments to amendments. And it got really confusing from what I've been able to read and understand about it. So during this confusing round of amendments and amendments to amendments, the language was added that says the UMC does not condone the practice of homosexuality and considers this practice incompatible with Christian teaching. From what I've read about the people who had made the original proposal that came forward, they were more focused on the church protecting the civil rights of people who might be homosexual and tried to stay away from this kind of question because they knew it would split the church. But it got added. Those words were added in, and 50 years later, we are still fighting over those words that were put in. This is all a confusing section for many people, not just this line, but a lot of the stuff that's in the book, this part of the Book of Discipline, because on one hand, this statement clearly states that all people are of sacred worth, created in God's image, in need of ministry of the church, as well as spiritual and emotional care and fellowship. And yet at the same time, it sets out language that has been interpreted to say just the opposite. Not for everyone, but some people take this as saying the opposite. They see it as saying LGBT people should not be allowed to fully take part in the life of the church, either through marriage or its clergy, or as laid out in other paragraphs that we'll see and that are on your handout. Even more devastating has been how these interpretations have been carried further by some people, to the point of even suggesting that LGBT folks are not worthy and should not be allowed in the church. and that their children should not be baptized, that they should just basically be removed in whatever way they can. And that's not this church, that's not most of the church in the U.S., but there are places in the world where this is how these lines are interpreted. And this discrepancy is at the heart of why so many have trouble with the rules the way they are written. Further confusion comes around in paragraph 304 when it talks about qualifications for ordination. The actual text says, while persons set apart by the church for ordained ministry are subject to all the frailties of human condition and pressures of society, they are required to maintain the highest standards of holy living in the world, and the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. Therefore, self-avowed practicing homosexuals are not to be certified as candidates for ministry. And yet, many homosexual people who are trying to become clergy live lives beyond reproach in every way. They live committed relationships with one person. They raise children. They're pillars in their community. They do everything that it says a person to be ordained should be, except for who they choose to love. So that becomes confusing for some people who say, well, you're saying this, and then you're saying something special for these special people. And paragraph 341.6 talks about ceremonies that celebrate homosexual union shall not be conducted by our ministers and shall not be conducted in our churches. And yet again, the rest of the book talks about how everyone should be seen as a child of God and treated equally. And so these pieces of language that don't seem to fit together are why many people disagree with the book and what's in it today. We also have the issue of what's called the clergy covenant. When you become a clergy person, there's this understanding that you're going to live by certain rules. And some people see it as this inviolable covenant you make with other clergy people. And they will argue that anybody who does not agree to follow these rules to the letter are in violation of that covenant and should lose their orders. This rests in part on the concept of the historic examination question, something everyone is asked as they go to be ordained. And among those questions it says, do you know the general rules of our church? Do you know the general rules of the church? 3 rules. Do good, do no harm, and stay in love of God. So everybody can say yes to those. Will you keep them? Everybody agrees with them. Have you studied the doctrines of the Methodist Church? After full examination, do you believe that our doctrines are in harmony with Holy Scripture? The doctrines, most people will say yes. Will you preach and maintain them? Have you studied our form of church discipline and polity? And do you approve of our church government and polity?
Oops, I just got up and said that I didn't.
Right. And this is where we start to have questions. And then question 13 says, will you support and maintain them? And it's those last 2 questions, it depends on, different people interpret what the question is asking in different ways. To start with, it's clear that many other parts of the Book of Discipline are ignored regularly by many clergy people. And yet that same level of accountability doesn't apply as applies to the question of homosexuality and how you feel about that. For example, every church must have an organized unit of UMW. If you do not, your pastor can be brought up on charges. Okay. Most churches these days do not.
There are 6 denominational special offerings that we're supposed to take.
That's another one.
And people have pushed me on that because we don't take them all every year because we have a lot of our own special offerings. But it's in the Book of Discipline.
And we can be brought up on charges if we don't take those offerings. Every church should have an organized church school or Sunday school program.
Except some of them don't have children.
Right. That's great if you have kids, but if you don't have kids, you're in violation of the Book of Discipline. There are some churches, especially down south, they do rebaptisms on a regular basis. If we were to rebaptize someone who had been baptized in another denomination or something, we can be brought up on charges. It never happens. One piece I was reading as I was getting ready for this, the guy actually looked at the numbers and said, if we follow the rules on that, like we tried to on the homosexuality question, there are some of the conferences down south that have very few pastors left in it. They would lose more people for that than they do for people who want to do marriages. There are still churches who refuse female pastors or cross-cultural or racial appointments. That's a violation that should have the whole church in trouble. Yet nobody's ever brought up on charges in any way for that. So we're left with this unequal distribution of the rules and how they're applied. When they call for this adherence to the Book of Discipline, you must do exactly what it says. One of the Methodist things has always been, we allow a lot of leeway, except for on this one question. The second piece of it that a lot of pastors, and it was my fault as I went through this process. First of all, the book says we can change it, so if no one ever wanted to change it, it would never change. We'd still be stuck with that little pamphlet of the 1800s. So we know that people all the time don't agree and they fight to change it. The second part is that in our baptismal vows, or when we get affirmed in the church, or we repeat basically the same thing, and it says we accept the freedom and power that God gives you to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves. Many of the pastors who are involved in this debate see this as oppression and injustice. So they are living into their baptismal vows to say, I challenge what this is. The Book of Discipline also provides for civil disobedience. You all might remember that, like Martin Luther King stuff and Gandhi stuff. It actually tells pastors, if you think that a governmental agency is enacting a law, actually what it says is the right of individuals to dissent when acting under the constraint of conscience and after having exhausted all legal recourse to resist or disobey laws that they deem to be unjust or that are discriminately enforced. Even then, respect for law should be shown by refraining from violence and being willing to accept the costs of disobedience. And we do not encourage or condone any form of violent protest as legitimate exercise of free speech or civil disobedience. So it tells pastors, you have a right to do this if you think the government has put an unjust law into place. That same section also asserts the duty of churches to support those who suffer because of their standards of conscience represented by nonviolent beliefs or acts. And so it says the church should support people in civil disobedience. The problem some people have with that is they say, well, this isn't a government, this is the church. So the church can say whatever it wants and you shouldn't disobey it. Other people argue, well, this is church government. Well, yeah, right. So even though it's the rules of the church, it's still a government that some people disagree with. So the Book of Discipline is really confusing in that it seems to set one set of standards and then say they don't apply here. It seems to set rules that say you have to act in certain ways, you can be brought up in charges, but then it doesn't apply them on anything else in the same way. It's confusing. It's hard to know how to follow it because no one follows the Book of Discipline every line for line. I'll skip over that part. So, in order to I could go on for a long time with all the details and the rules, but this just kind of gives you the idea. The biggest problem with following the Book of Discipline is that it's not followed. It never has been followed word for word. There's always been a lot of leeway and a lot of acceptance that not everybody agrees because we don't reach consensus and we understand that there are cultural things that affect parts of the world. So it's always been applied with a lot of room for justice rather than black and white. But on this one question, it isn't. And that's why we're in the state we're in today. I did want to go on and talk, what can any church or any pastor do to call for change, though, if they see something that they disagree with? Holly already mentioned what happens at conference. You send in your petition, it goes through the committees. And one of the things the committees do is, I know this year they're probably going to get 75 or 80 petitions that say, we think what happened in 2019 should be thrown out, and here's how we think it should go. All of them are not going to come to the floor,
Right.
but they will try to work it into a format that a few of them might come forward. So anybody can make a petition.
Quick
Yes.
question, can individual churches,
Yes, that's what I was just about to say.
This
An
church
individual.
actually joined with a couple other churches already
Right.
on a different topic. There's a list of things that clergy may not do, and another church noticed that missing from that list was domestic violence. And so they wrote a petition asking that domestic violence be forbidden to clergy, and asked if other churches would also sign up. So our church council looked at that and added our church council's name to that petition.
Right. And so a petition can come from a conference like our annual conference. This year, several petitions were passed at annual conference asking that the conference submit it to general conference. An individual church can write one. An individual, any member of the United Methodist Church can send a petition to general conference.
And there are individuals who send hundreds.
Yes, which is one of the reasons why the committees have so much work to do.
They're notorious.
So there is that, to actually make an official petition to say, we disagree with, we want to see change, we make a statement, and whatever you want it to say, there are guidelines on how to write that and send it in. The second thing that any church or individual can do is make public statements of your concern or disapproval. That's kind of where the reconciling ministry and stuff comes in. It is a group of people that have stood together and said, on this issue, we disagree. But there are many other issues that people disagree with. The official stance of the church on abortion is we respect the sanctity of life. You know, we'd love to see that it not happen, but we understand that in some cases it is important, and therefore we will not stand in the way of it. But there are people within the church who think that that's wrong. In fact, on both sides, there are people within the church who think it should be one or the other. It shouldn't be this both and type response. So a lot of different questions will have groups come up and make statements. One of the big things right now is Palestine and Israel and all that happens over there. And the fact that our government, the federal government, passed a law, which I haven't read, so I don't know exactly how far it goes, but they're trying to make it illegal to call for disinvestment from groups in Israel that are doing damage to the Palestinian folks. We have people on both sides of that issue in the church, and they get together and they make a lot of noise, and they have their witnesses at every meeting. So it's not just this question, but any group that wants to, or any individual that wants to, can make those kind of public statements. The other thing to do is take action, take a public stance in some way to demonstrate a concern. You may have seen that some churches have started putting rainbow flags out on this question. Again, that kind of ties into the reconciling idea, but you don't have to be reconciling to do that. You can talk to your local media. The day after General Conference this year, they were calling us up, asking for quotes. And it was like, we're not getting into that right now. But taking a public stance as an individual is something you can do. I know on this question, at the Pride Parade every year, there are some reconciling churches that take part in the parade. There are some individuals from churches that aren't reconciling who go and take part in the parade. Methodism is, and always has been, about individuals standing up and taking a stance. Back in the early 20th century, it was exactly this kind of action that many Methodist individuals and churches were part of the Get Women the Right to Vote stuff. They were part of child labor laws being enacted, part of the 40-hour work week being enacted. So taking action in some way publicly is not a violation of the Book of Discipline. And the last is civil disobedience, as I noted in the Book of Discipline. There are some people who just go and march. There are other people who actually try to get themselves arrested to raise awareness. So anytime somebody disagrees with what's in there, these are different responses you can take that are all appropriate. You're not violating the rules if you do them. And again, in regard to the current situation, all those things are on the table. Our real hope for many of us is that next spring in 2020, when the world meets again, the actions that have been taken up to this point to show the displeasure with the rules that were created in 2019, some change will be made. Annual conferences voted for delegates to go to the General Conference a few months ago, and 75% or more of the conferences in the United States voted for delegations that are going to go and say, we don't like what happened. Some of them are here, some of them are here, but very few of them think that what got passed was appropriate in the way it stands today. Interestingly, just last night the news came out. During the General Conference, it was noted that many people from some countries didn't show up and didn't get their credentials. And the next day, those credentials were handed out, even though there was no proof that people had shown up. At least 4 documented cases of people voting who shouldn't have been voting. And so the rule that was passed about how a church can disaffiliate, which some of you may have paid attention to, was thrown out last night. Because the difference in votes was 2, and there were at least 4 people that they know shouldn't have been voting. So they can't say that it was a valid vote. So we're still in flux. Even the stuff that we thought we knew is still changing. So that's why the real hope is that 2020 will give us something that's much more understandable, much more of a consensus building type thing than a 51-49 vote, which is, it wasn't 51-49, I think it came down to 53-47 is the way the vote split up. In the meantime, the best thing for churches to do is to work on education like we're doing right now, so that you have a better understanding of what the options might be with whatever gets voted in 2020, so that you have a better understanding of who that church sees itself to be. That's something that Paul and the church council already started to work on before any of this even happened. What is it? What do we mean when we say we're a welcoming church, and how do we really live that out? To have a better understanding of the processes of the United Methodist Church, of the nature of the connectional part of the church, and how that defines it, and what it means to be part of the UMC as we know it today. Again, hopefully this hasn't been the clearest presentation on it, but it gives you an idea of some of the how muddled it can be until you really start to look at it in depth. With that, I just want to thank you all for coming today. If anybody has any questions, it may take a while to decipher them.
Bring them to us at other times, too.
Yeah, I don't think either one of us would consider ourselves a parliamentarian, so we don't really know the rules.
Yeah, I have a book about Robert's Rules of Order. I just don't respect Robert's Rules of Order all that much.
Yeah. Well, and that's a big part of why the meetings get to be the way they are. We follow Robert's Rules of Order, which say, if somebody wants to make an amendment, okay, we'll look at that. Now, somebody wants to make an amendment of that, okay, we'll look at that. And you can just keep adding them on.
Lose track of the original.
And you get to the 15th amendment on amendment on amendment, and then you gotta vote each one backwards up the chain.
And the possibility of someone being confused and not really voting their conscience because they didn't know we were on this instead of this amendment instead of the original.
Right.
It's huge.
That actually happened a couple weeks later. 2012, I think it was. Some big vote was taken on the floor, and enough people complained when they saw the final result posted. They said, "Well, that's not what I wanted, but that's how I voted." So they had to reopen the vote and do it again.
We're willing to reopen.
It's in 2012. Is it March?
2020, probably April,
April?
and it's in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
So it's United States?
Yeah. Well, it has been up until this.
2024, I think it's supposed to be in Zimbabwe or Africa. They're trying to move it around. And it's this assumption that we're a global body, but we're really run by the United States.
And one of the big
Majority
things,
of Methodists are United States. Worldwide.
2/3,
from United Methodist,
60 to
Yeah.
70% somewhere from the US.
I went to the World Methodist meeting in 2010, and I didn't realize how many denominations are Wesleyan/Methodist in their
That
origin.
aren't part of our
They're not part of our denomination. There are a lot of Methodist churches around the world that are not United Methodist.
Your friends are Freemason.
Freemasons, yeah.
There's
Well, there's been these sort of changes and fights and branching off throughout our history around slavery, around whether to have bishops or not, lay representation at decision-making bodies, and then women's representation, and then women's ordination. Each of them sort of creates a crisis and offshoots.
So all those offshoot Methodist churches are not part of the United Methodist Church.
And also there are
The Wesleyan-
churches that were from, birthed from Methodist missions that have not chosen to be part of the denomination. So Brazil has lots of Methodist churches. They're just the Methodist Church of Brazil. They're not part of the United Methodist Church.
Methodist Church of South Africa, I know.
Is not a.
Is not part of-
Interesting.
No, they're not part of the United Methodist Church.
What about AME?
The AME is one of the first ones to split off.
Yes.
In the
Because-
1780s and 90s, the black folks were feeling, we're not being included here, why are you kicking us to the back of the church? And they went off and started their own. And then AME Zion split off, and CME,
CME was the southern one, yeah.
right? And then there are all these different branches of basically folks who recognized they weren't being treated equally in the church and said, we're going separate, which is, today you look at the United Methodist Church in America and we say it's very white. That's why. Because all the black Methodists went and started their own church because they weren't being given equal treatment in the church.
I didn't know those roots were original Methodist churches.
Yes.
I mean, it's long before United Methodism.
Yeah,
back
right,
in the 18th and 19th century. But apparently the Salvation Army was part of the Methodist movement. I didn't know that, but they were at this World Methodist meeting. The Church of the Nazarene has some connection to us. I was amazed at them all there. And the United Methodist, it was funny to see the United Methodist in Congo, their bishops were all there. They were wearing long purple robes and mitres, like they were Catholic.
Huh.
Yeah, so even within the United Methodist Church, there's a lot of variation as places around the world have said, well, we're going to become part of United Methodism, but we come from a different beginning. So there's a lot of variation, which is why this idea of we must all vote, it just doesn't seem to fit who we ever have been, really. Liddell had a question. Now I'll
Yes,
get you.
I had a question about what sounds like the wiggle room that you have with the Book of Discipline. And I wondered, is it like a mindset of don't ask, don't tell? Is that how everything just
That's not the,
seems to go without punishment or whatever?
for a long time, it's not so much don't ask, don't tell, but John Wesley supposedly said, let us all love alike if we cannot all think alike, and we should be agreeing on the essentials, but in all else show charity. So it's a continuation of that idea that we're not going to be all the same, especially the way the church was created. He went out to people and took people from all other denominations and people who had never been in the church. And his own history, as I read his journals, it's filled with, this is what I thought today, and then I met these people, and I saw the light of what they were talking about. And so we're going to change a little bit. We're going to change. We're going to change. Methodism has always been a denomination that adapted ideas and lived under that big umbrella until questions like this come up, and then sadly what we often see are churches split. There were some churches in the early days who were happy to have black folks in them, but many of them were, well, they can come, but they have to sit over there. Sit in the balcony, they can't speak, they can't come forward and be part of worship, they can't be part of the leadership of worship. And when it gets to that point is when the church splits. Sue had a question first.
I just, I've been trying to read about 2020, and I just noticed that they're putting out a call for choirs and bands and
Yep.
stuff like that.
That's the worship side. not the
Yeah,
legislation
I
side.
don't,
That's the good part.
but if they're doing that, what happens to the law side, to the rule side? Where is some writing on the various laws? This is what we're going to consider. If we're going to consider the choir, why don't we consider the discipline? These are the ideas we're floating.
Well, it might help you. There are different committees that put together a conference. There was a worship committee. That's all of those folks were, I won't say all, but that's their focus. The Then there's the legislative committee. I don't even know what they're.
Right, well, the Commission on General Conference was just meeting,
Right.
and that's where this news about the voting irregularities came out. I haven't read anything more extensive about what they did in preparation for 2020.
But even within our own annual conference, we have the same type of thing.
Yeah.
There's a worship committee, and those people work for the whole year to plan worship for the next year. And most of them don't get very involved in the politics side because they're focused on worship. There's a spiritual piece. This year there was this folks who have gone through the Tending the Soul, which is education for spiritual direction. Some of those folks got together and they had the prayer tent and a special prayer room. Sherry spent the whole weekend in the room with anybody who needed prayer. She didn't even know what was going on the floor while we were at conference. She'd come out at a lunch break and say, "So what happened?" And I try to fill her in. So there are those kind of things. Hopefully that helps your answer, helps your question a little bit. No?
No.
We'll talk some more then.
No. Here's a good sign.
Okay. But yeah,
What does it mean exactly to be a reconciled church? Like, I feel like I use that term, I heard people say that that's something that is like churches choose to do, to become.
right. The Reconciling Ministries movement, the Reconciling Ministries Network, is a place for people who say we think everyone, not just LGBT people, but everyone should be included in the life of the church fully. And hopefully you don't get a group that says we're reconciling, but we don't want those folks to be part of the church, because then they're not really reconciling. The main focus of it in recent years has been this question, because it's become such a hot topic. If you consider yourself a reconciling person, you can go to the website and sign up as an individual. And it simply means that you advocate for full inclusion. And how you do that is your own personal level of it, but you can't be somebody that says, I believe people should be allowed in church with me, but they shouldn't be able to do this. That's not reconciling. Reconciling is full inclusion of everybody in all aspects of the life of the church. Some churches are not there, but there are groups of people within the church that are. So they create a class, a small group that says we are the such and such group of this church, and we consider ourselves reconciling, and we will continue to advocate for that. Some churches do it, and they go all the way to saying we will advocate for this. None of that is against the Book of Discipline. Until the moment that you let somebody come down the aisle and get married, then you've broken the rules. A lot of reconciling churches consider that question really strongly. A lot of pastors who are part of the Reconciling Network have, they have to face the question of, I'm going to advocate for this, but am I going to cross the line and actually do a wedding? That's kind of what it's about. If you want to find out more, there's a website at rmnetwork.org, where there's pages and pages and pages of stuff you can read.
But basically, I would say, and you can correct me if this is not true, becoming a reconciling church does not mean that we're then free to break away from the rules of the discipline.
Right.
We're still bound by the rules of discipline, so we couldn't have a pastor do a same-gender marriage here and not have the pastor face consequences.
So it doesn't really accomplish something then, other than just you making a statement.
You're
It's a statement.
Yes.
It's a statement to the church that we think things are different, and it's a statement to the world that says this church will welcome you, and we'll do our best to support you.
What I started to say, but I almost jumped ahead of your question.
Go ahead.
Like, you mentioned, like, and sadly, what happens then is the church splits. Like, I'm almost curious as to why you say sadly, because it sounds like that's been a part of the progression of almost every church, and it seems like that has to help, that helps evolution happen in terms of beliefs.
In some ways, yes. The Methodist Church has this long history of this. Over the question of slavery, goes back to our very first meeting. Eventually that resulted by 1848, the church north and the church south split. Became very different even before the U.S. went to the Civil War. After the Civil War, the church came back together, but not until 1928. So it took 80 years for that split to be fixed.
And it wasn't really fixed.
And it wasn't really fixed.
So when it was fixed
Yeah.
in 1939, in order to keep some of the southern folk happy,
we formed a Methodist church in which we segregated African American churches and did not include them in regional annual conference. We put them together in their own non-regional central conference. So,
And part of that, I understand, was because folks in the South didn't want to take the chance of having a black bishop
yeah.
or having a black pastor.
So we capitulated to some pretty unsavory stuff in the interest of unity.
Yeah, that lasted until 1968.
Until 68, we finally dissolved the central jurisdiction, that's what it's called, central jurisdiction. And it said, great, y'all can be part of our regional annual conferences now, which was the right thing to do, except it had a downside in that people of color had formed their own communities and their own power structures, and then they got all subsumed into bigger, and so it cost me again.
But I hear what you're saying too. Sometimes a split might be the answer. But and on a theological level, that's one thing. But what really hurts is when you come to a church like this. The local church where people don't agree, but we've been able to live together, come to consensus on how we're going to move forward and live together in peace for decades. Even though this question has existed, it's never really been a big issue here. When the big church splits, it now says to each individual church, well, you have to make a decision go one way or the other now. So that's where the unfortunate part comes in. If the big church could learn to live like the individual churches do, we'd be a lot better off.
And there would be some consequence if we, as this church decided to split away from the United Methodist organization, there'd be financial repercussions. We have, retirement plans for our pastors that are embedded in the system. Our buildings are embedded in that system. So that is a pretty major thing to consider, too. So if you're going to leave, you can say, oh, my little church family wants to embrace this and we can just walk away. There's repercussions to that.
And that's the piece that got thrown out last night. General Conference had come up with this plan for how you might be able to do that, which wasn't financially beneficial to small churches. But it was only a 2-person difference in the vote, and having 4 people that know shouldn't have been voting, they can't guarantee that it was a valid vote. So that'll have to come up again next spring. Anybody else have a question? I thank you all for coming and putting up with this. These are not professional presentations, but I'm trying to do the best we can to answer the questions that came up. That was how we